share my screen. And as Sophie mentioned, I'm going to kind of start from scratch. I'm going to imagine that this is the first time maybe you've actually seen Tableau. Maybe you've seen it before, but the goal of what I'm going to share with you is really to go from the very beginning all the way up through using Tableau as a way to build out visualizations. I'm going to bring up a couple of things on my screen as we get started so you have good context as to what the data we're working with is going to be. And I always feel like this is the most important thing in any situation is what is the data? What does one row of data represent? So ideally, you have downloaded that file that was available via the link Sophie had shared, or you got that via email. This is the data set we're going to be working with. It is one row of data represents a year and a country, and it has 3 key metrics on it: the gender wage gap at the median income or wage amount. These are percentage points. So you would read this as, in the year 2020, the wage gap between males and females was 12.3%, meaning women make 12.3% less than males in Australia. This is also a percentage, so the percentage of board seats that are sat in Australia by women. So we're saying 34% of board seats are by females. And then similarly, you would read this as 40% of managerial roles are given to or are consumed by women in Australia. And then if you read this down, you can see that we've got a couple other years of data to work with inside of the data set. I've also added on a couple of other things to this data set just to kind of help contextualize what it is we're looking at. In particular, I pulled both the female and male population of people aged 15 to 64. I'll give you a little bit more context around the background of this data set, but OECD basically qualifies someone as capable of working in a full-time role if they're between about the ages of 15 to 64. So pretty much, you know, you can work. 64 plus, likely you're retired. Under 15, clearly you're probably in school or otherwise. So this would be representative of the female population in that country for that given year of those between 15 and 64, and the males. And then this is just the sum of those two. So these two numbers should add up. If I'm looking down here on the right, I'm going to guess that's 164 million. My eyes might be deceiving me with commas here. Let's see. Oh, 16 million. That may make more sense. But this is just the sum of these two numbers together. I'm going to give you a little bit of background around why and how I source this data, because I think it's important as you guys are thinking about building out your applications. Sophie mentioned a whole ton of resources along the way as to where you can find clean data, and you're more than welcome to use this along the way. But I wanted to take you on just a quick journey that I went through as I was building out this data set. By no means is this a moment where you need to follow along. This is just to give you some good insight into how you might go about sourcing data for your application, or some tools you might be able to use, or just to get you thinking about how data is available and accessible here today, and what might be necessary to make a data set that you want to use for your application. So I'm going to start here, which is the OECD website. OECD, if you are not familiar with them, they are the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which, as they say, is an international organization that works to build better policies for better lives. They have many different data sets, and they almost have what I'd call a data portal or several databases along the way, with lots of sort of indicators and metrics to track the lives of individuals and to figure out how things are sort of shaping globally. In particular, they have a gender equity hub, and this is where I really started. Sophie actually was the one that recommended I look here to see if there was any data that I might find useful, since we wanted to gear this training towards women based on yesterday being International Women's Day. So this was where I started. You'll see that there are visualizations here. So I actually jumped directly into this employment section and started looking at data here. And you can see, obviously, from the hyperlinks where I've gone a bit from that. I'm just going to kind of expand this so you guys will get a good sense of what we could start with and some key information here. So this is the 2020 or latest available data per country, which will matter along the way, and what that wage gap is. So if we were to find Australia again, which is right here, you can see that there's a 12.3% wage gap, which aligns with what I had in my data set or in the data set that you have. The way OECD works is if you go to data, there's this very interesting sort of query builder and data exporter tool, and you can customize it from there. Again, this is not a training on how to use this. This is just me sharing back to you some of what I ended up doing along the way. So they have this separated out into different subject areas. You can see them on the left. I know they're quite small, but there's share of female managers, which was another interesting one I wanted to look at, and then female share of seats on boards of the largest publicly listed companies. So these three on the left were three different data sets that I pulled together, and then I combined them so that I could have them in one data set, which we are using for the sake of this training. One of the tools you will learn to use inside of the data school is something called Tableau Prep or Tableau Prep Builder, depending on your preference on how you want to describe it. They're interchangeable in my mind. But you can kind of see what I did here. I've got the board seat data that I exported, which is right here. And I've got my country, I've got my year, and I've got that percentage point. I've got the wage gap data here. And then I've got the female managers data here. I do a little bit of combining along the way. This is called a join in the data world. So I'm joining by year and country, meaning those are the two elements that need to match along the way so that I can basically affix on more metrics and have them all on one row of data. And I repeated that process for the board seats. At that point, I wanted a little bit more context to what we were doing. So I went ahead and added on regional information. So we had countries, but I wanted to identify what continent and what region they were in, region being something like Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe. Are we talking Central America? A little bit more insight than the direct continents, as we know that there are different economies and different political styles of countries throughout the world. So those were also affixed on. And then the last thing I wanted to do just to help kind of understand this a little bit further was I pulled some data from the United Nations, and this is what I was talking to you about before, which was around population. So I ended up pulling the population by age group for 15 to 19. There's some more age groups in there by year, and combining this so that I could have a data set that had what the female working population, the male working population, the year, and the country was, and then added that onto our data set. So once we got to the end of this entire prep workflow, we had this nice data set that represented and matches exactly what I showed you, which is this data set here. So all this to say, not to overwhelm you, but just to kind of prepare you for some of the work we end up doing in the data school and some of what you might want to consider doing for the sake of your application. It's absolutely not required. I'd say maybe you get bonus points for doing it, or maybe you want to do it because there's just some data points that you think go together, but maybe they're not in a data set together already. This is just me kind of giving you some direction in terms of how you might be able to do that. Inside of the data school, and I think Sophie mentioned this, not only do we use Tableau products, which would mean Tableau Desktop, which I'm going to show you. We haven't actually gone into that yet. Tableau Prep Builder, which you just got a taste of, and Tableau Server or Tableau Public, which is the way you can share out your visualizations. But we also use a tool called Alteryx, which does a lot of data prep and blending. Alteryx is somewhat similar to Prep Builder. It's got a couple more specialties and expertise areas than what Prep Builder has. So one of these is sort of a lighter tool, I would say, and one is heavy duty. Tableau Prep Builder being the lighter tool in my mind, and Alteryx being that really sturdy Swiss Army knife of working with your data. But this was just my process. And as I said, the way I started with this was I really started with that gender gap data. And I was like, there's more about this that I need to know as I'm trying to put together a data story, as I'm trying to explore this. And that's what led me down the path of adding additional data points. So as you are thinking about your application, think about maybe what additional information or sort of follow-up questions you would want in the form of data to be available for the sake of what you're trying to visualize and communicate out to our hiring team. Okay, so I'm going to close this. I'm just going to save this, and I'm going to close this out. I'm also going to close down our data set so we have that available for working with Tableau. And I'm just going to move these off my screen over to the left. And now we're going to get to the fun part, which is actually working in Tableau. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Tableau Desktop. At this point, I'm also going to set a timer on my watch so that we have about an hour of time to work with. That'll keep me honest. And we'll get started with the Tableau Desktop side of things. So anytime I'm teaching someone Tableau Desktop for the very first time, this is how we always begin. You open Tableau Desktop, you can see in the top left, it says Book 1, but the important part are these 3 sections here in the beginning screen, so to speak. In the middle of the screen, you're going to have all of your recent workbooks and work. So you can see I've been building a calendar. You can see I've got some recruiting information for Data School New York. I've even opened someone's recent application around Pokemon. But this will be where you can access any project that you've been working on in the past in Tableau Desktop. You can also pin your favorites there if you want, and you can also take things off if you don't want them to be visible in your recents if you need that. Over on the right, I kind of call this like the eye candy section, or like the how you get to know a little bit more about Tableau. You've got what they call the Discover section. It's broken into 2 kind of concepts. One is training. I think most things you're going to find in the training section are videos. So these are much more someone explaining to you how the tool works, walking through sort of micro modules, if you will, that Tableau makes free and available to everyone. And then this second section, the resources, those are more knowledge articles, blogs, other launching points. So less like video-based content and more reading-based content that you can have. But those are both good resources over on the right that you can always use as a starting point if you're looking to just know more about Tableau tools in general. And then over on the left, this is my favorite part, or I'll say this, I'll probably say I have another favorite part in about 20 minutes, but my favorite part of this first 3 sections, I should say, is how are the connectors to all the different data sources that you can connect to. I'm using the full version of Tableau Desktop, which means I have a lot of options. If you are using Tableau Public, you'll have much smaller list of options, but it's important that you see all the options that are available. At its core, I like to call Tableau Desktop a data reader. So just imagine we are pointing Tableau Desktop at any of these databases, data sources. They can be files like Excel spreadsheets or CSV files like you've got for the sake of this training. They can be databases like a SQL Server. If that sounds like a crazy thing to say out loud, that's fine. We'll tell you what a SQL Server is. It's just a fancy name for where data is stored. And you can see all the different database types that exist and then some. So it's always relevant anytime I'm talking to someone who doesn't know what Tableau is to say, look, Tableau is a data reader. You point it at your data and then you start querying it, analyzing it, visualizing it all on top of it. And it's also an important paradigm because any work that we do in Tableau Desktop doesn't disturb the underlying data. It remains in its raw, cleaned up form, ideally ready for analysis, and anything we're doing is only within Tableau Desktop or in the constructs of a dashboard or visualizations. That's a lot different from someone who maybe was making pivot tables and charts and maybe subtables and other things inside of Excel or Google Sheets, where it's not uncommon for you to hand key in data or modify data or do calculations to clean up the data. Once you work in the Tableau realm and the tools that we work with, you're actually not going to be disturbing the raw underlying data at all. We're going to keep it sort of pristine off to the side and just build up from on top of that. Okay, so now you've gotten a good insight into just the starting point of it. I am now going to connect to a text file, which should be the file that you all have access to, which is this OECD Women Employment Measures file. And I'm going to go ahead and open that. Once you do that, you get to this data source section. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller because my taskbar is kind of hiding the bottom part. You're going to see a couple things. One, Tableau is automatically reading in that data, which I want it to do. It's already showing me a preview of the data table of everything that we just saw when I opened it in Excel. So I'm seeing the first 100 rows of data. Some things I like to point out on this screen are, first, over on the left, we've got what I think Tableau would call, or I would call, the metadata. So we've got all the column names here that are working, that we have available to work with. We've got what their field types are. And this is just good, especially if you're working with more than one data table or something, to see where the source of the data came from. But this is a nice way to just sort of visually see in the list format, which columns of data do I have in my data set. And then over on the right-hand side, again, you can see that sort of preview of all of the data, and you can see these data types as well. So as an example, if for some reason something came in as a string or text as opposed to a number in this screen, and we can do it later on, but you'd be able to modify that field type by clicking on something like this, and you can change what type it is. So this is a number, it's a whole number, that makes sense. You can see Tableau has even done me a solid. While this says country and there's words in here, it's actually identified that it's a string calculation, but it's given it a default geographic role of country. So there's some smartness that Tableau does whenever we're getting started reading in our data. We could always change this if it didn't make sense, but for now it makes sense. And in particular, we're going to see when we do a little bit of mapping why it's useful that this has that globe indicator indicating that Tableau understands that it's geography. The other one that's important, and I'll give you a little bit more information as we transition into building visualizations, would be this date icon or this calendar icon. So one of the reasons I like working with Tableau is it works really well with dates. If you are working with any time-bound data, so dates or dates and times, it's always extremely beneficial for you to have Tableau read it in as a date, to set it as a date type. You will allow or unlock a lot of potential for how Tableau wants to work with dates if you focus on that paradigm. If you have some experience in analysis and are maybe looking at Tableau for the first time, you may be familiar with, okay, I have a column for the month number, I have a column for the day number, I have a column for the year, but you don't actually have like a date listed in there. Tableau really wants you to have that date. So that's one of the first things I usually coach out of people when they are struggling with doing any sort of time-bound analysis, is to make them in those date types. And in that regard, Tableau is actually really handy with helping you. If you have some sort of string name, like let's say you have some weird date format that it's not reading in, but maybe it is a date, Tableau has a lot of built-in logic to turn that into a date. So just know if you're getting started with your own application data and there's time in there or a date in there that's maybe not functioning, go ahead and click on this icon and set the data type to date and see how it previews itself on this screen. Okay, I'm going to continue to move forward here, and let's just now focus on the bottom right. So after you connect to data, and this is really the workflow. So you connect to data and then you start going into a worksheet. A worksheet is where an individual visualization is going to live. You can see across the bottom, I've got 3 icons here. I've got one for a worksheet, which is exactly what you're looking at. One for a dashboard, which we will ideally build in the scope of the 51 minutes we have left, which is just a collection of sheets all put together, all sort of consolidated toward one message or one analysis. And then there's also something called a story. A story is a way to present both single worksheets and dashboards in Tableau Desktop. Think of it as a way to sort of generate slides and add additional annotations in to whatever it is you're working on. In practice and in true form, I don't use stories very much. So it's not going to be covered today. It's mostly one of those things that it's good for you to know. They're actually better if you are standing in front of an audience, either virtually or in person, and you are paging through the slides and you are kind of pointing them out along the way. Dashboards tend to be a lot more popular because we can have better interactivity and they're designed for other people to actually work with and consume them. Okay, so I've oriented you a little bit with what a worksheet is, what a dashboard is, and what a story is. Before I go any further, I'm going to do this. You do not need to follow along on this part. I'm going to make my font a little bit bigger. I'm going to adjust everything in the workbook to make it a little bit bigger and a little bit bolder. So ideally, it's easier for you to read. This is also somewhat what I do whenever I'm working with any sort of new dashboard and I get a new request. I find it easy to have sort of my preferences of preset fonts. It just makes me feel a little bit more secure that I'm not starting from just like an empty blank canvas. and instead I have some sort of purpose and I know it's going to be sort of in my style. If you are building your application, be thinking about that too. Like if it makes you feel a little bit better to work in a specific font, go ahead and do that. I know a lot of times when folks are out on placement and they're doing consulting, there's usually a style guide that you can adhere to. So consider this a way to sort of have your own personal style guide and feel less, make it feel a little less daunting, like you're starting completely from scratch. Okay, so now I've got, I'm going to keep this small. Now I've got our font set, and I want you to focus over on the left here, and let me make this a little bit wider so you can see it. What we had previously in the data source section, so here's our rows of data, here's our columns, here they are here. You can now see them over on the left. This is called the data pane, and you can see that we've got the list of every single field that we've got. So we've got continent, country, region, year, and then we've got this horizontal line, and then we have what are called measures down below. And what's above that horizontal line are things that are traditionally thought of as dimensions. Dimensions building headers, useful for filters. Think of these as different ways to slice and dice your data. And then measures being things that are likely going to be aggregated. So you're going to take the sum, the average. These are most likely the numbers associated with your analysis. It's not always one-to-one that way. I mean, a good example would be if you just had a 4-digit year, that's clearly a number, but you're more likely to use that to slice and dice your data. You're not going to sum up the year numbers. That's not really going to be helpful in the sake of an analysis. But it's nice to know how Tableau sort of separates those out along the way. 2 other points for me to share here are latitude and longitude show up. Those are automatically generated. One, when we have a field that Tableau recognizes as a geographic element, it will automatically use that latitude and longitude that's generated to then be useful inside of a map. So that's also helpful. And then the other one is this kind of long and unfriendly calculation called the OECD Women Employment Measures.csv parentheses count. All this is the row count, or the number of records that exist in the data set. It gets a little bit more sophisticated as you have more than one data set or data table that you're working with. But for now, it's appropriate to say that this measure right here relates to the number of records in our data set. So there should be 206 rows of data in the data set that you've got. These are all also italicized because they're automatically generated by Tableau. But now you've got a good insight into just the actual functionality and the layout of data in a worksheet and how Tableau works. Also, if you are brand new to Tableau and this is the first time you've opened up Tableau Desktop or Tableau Public, and you're building visualizations, you're likely to see this Show Me menu. Now, Show Me is extremely helpful because it gives you sort of a blueprint or a recipe on how you would want to make visualizations. So if I go here, it says, oh, if you want to make a filled map, I'm going to need one dimension that's a geographic dimension and is also a blue pill, which I'll try to get to, and at least 0, but ideally 1 measure or green field to be able to then, if you can imagine, have a country filled in and then shaded by whatever that measure is. For the sake of learning and to get good at Tableau, I usually tell people to hide Show Me. Don't click on the top here and just tuck it away. It's useful if you're trying to build a chart type for the first time that you may be less familiar with, or useful to see and hover over the recipes. But beyond that, I really encourage people not to rely on Show Me and instead to focus on the actual tool itself. And what I mean by that are these different sections which end up controlling how we work with our visualizations. The column shelf, the rows shelf, the marks card, which has a bunch of little shelves on them, the filter shelf, and the pages shelf. As we start working with this data, you're going to see how some of that unfolds, and we'll get good insight into working with it. Okay, so nothing awesome so far. We haven't actually done anything other than me just sort of explain Tableau Desktop to you. So let's actually drag some data into our canvas and start analyzing what we've got. I gave you a quick 206 row count. This is a bar chart. but let's get a little bit more tactical here. We know that first, the priority of this data is to focus on the gender wage gap. So let's go ahead and drag out a couple of fields and let's see how Tableau responds. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to double click year, and you'll notice that when I do that, Tableau automatically puts this up on the column shelf. I'm going to go ahead and set this to entire view. And then I want to double click and bring on the gender wage gap at median. A couple things about this which aren't great to begin with, but maybe we'll bring country on to our rows. So first, this is sort of aggregated. This is the sum of all the gender wage gaps at the median, which are all percentages, which first we can't really math up because they're distinct for each country. And this number actually has no legitimate or sensible value. So what we can do is we can add on country, and now we're seeing by country, by year, what that percentage point wage gap was. And I will actually just expand this for my entire screen. The first thing I want to do is right click here on the gender wage gap at median, and let's set the default properties and let's adjust the number format. So in particular, this came through as a decimal number, but we know it needs to be a percentage. So I'm actually going to adjust this, and I'm going to change it such that we're not showing decimal points on it, but we do have a percentage at the right. And if you're asking me or thinking to yourself, why is Anne clicking on the number parentheses custom versus percentage? Percentage is relevant and would be useful if the data had them as decimals themselves. So instead of 19.2, if it were in the data as 0.192, that's when we would set it to percentage. But because they came through as what I'm calling percentage points, which are basically the same thing, instead of adjusting it and basically multiplying by 100 additionally and adding the percentage, instead I'm just adding the percentage as a suffix at the end. And when we do this right click, and this will be something very common that you'll hear from me, pretty much everything you can do in Tableau is a right click away. We change the default formatting of this metric, which means every single time we use this metric, we will be able to have it come onto the screen or into a visualization as a percentage. And I actually want us to go ahead and do that for the percentage of female managers while we're here. Let's do the exact same thing where we set it as 0, and let's add a percentage point. And let's do the same thing for the female board seats. This way, when we're working with them, anytime we bring them onto our visualizations, we'll see exactly the same thing. Now, if you've ever been to one of our meet and greets in the past, we usually start this off with saying, okay, what can you find? We usually present a data table very much like this and ask the question, which country has the largest wage gap, or which country and which year in combination have the largest wage gap, where the higher the percentage number, the larger the wage gap. So I'm going to pause because no one has seen this data set. This isn't a relatively easy question to see. And I want to visually ask you all to tell me which country and year combination have the most disparity or the largest percentage wage gap. And I will wait because I have coffee to drink. Okay, I will assume that this is a very painful exercise for all of you to be able to identify what that largest number is, which is the exact purpose of what data visualization is useful for. One thing we could do just easily to help us identify that further would be to take something like this calculation. I'm going to hold down my control key and I'm going to drag it onto color. And now we can see the darker the color, the larger the number. And we could actually even make this a bit more clear. I'm guessing maybe go something that made a little bit more sense. The darker the red, the larger the number, the larger the gap. So I think if I'm looking at this correctly, that Korea, this is South Korea, by the way, has the largest wage gap of the OECD data that I actually found. at 37%, which means that for every dollar that a male makes, a female makes 37% less, or 63 cents on the dollar, which is a huge difference and a disparity that we will get into along the way. Okay, so we've now kind of explored the data a little bit. I'm just looking over at the left on the chat that's coming through. And it looks like, Luke, you've got it covered as it relates to mapping in Tableau. Yes, just to repeat what Luke said, you can out of the box map in Tableau Desktop on many geographic levels, all the way from MSA, if you're in the United States, to states, to countries, and to continents. I think you can do continents. Actually, I don't think you can do continents now that I say it out loud. Can't remember. But you can always customize beyond that. One of the things Tableau does really well is it can read in different geospatial files as well. So if you have custom territories, custom geographic objects, custom points, or just simply latitude and longitude or map coordinates, it can plot those on a map. A lot of the really savvy Tableau users in the Tableau community realize that at its heart, Tableau Desktop plots things on X and Y axes, so they use that to their advantage. Okay, but getting back on track, this at least gives us a little bit of knowledge, and this is actually a really good place to start along the way, because yeah, see, Sam, isn't that weird? You can't do continents out of the box. I think I saw something on our internal dialogue about that recently, and I thought that was a weird thing. Seems like an easy thing to have Tableau add in. But anyway, moving on. Looking at this data, there's a couple things I want to focus on, which are the gaps that we've got. So this data set that I have is a little bit sparse. And what I mean by that is if I were to do any sort of trend analysis, and maybe you will actually do that now that we've got some sense of where the gender and wage gap disparities are. I mean, we're getting a sense that South Korea obviously has a large gap, and then here's Japan. So obviously we're talking about Asia at this point in time. I mean, let's actually see this in a trend line and see what it looks like. So let's just call this wage gap by country and year to begin with, and we'll just keep moving forward. So I'm going to make another new visualization. I hope you'll make one with me. This time we're going to be a little bit more savvy. This time, instead of just double clicking the year, we're going to do it the right way, which would be right click and drag. Let's go ahead and drag year onto our column shelf. I'm going to just set it to this one right here. I'm going to set it to year. It hasn't done anything demonstrably different than what we did the first time. But as I do that drag and drop, which let me do it one more time, you'll notice we've got this nice drop menu that lets us decide how we want to work with our data. I won't get too in the weeds, but it's probably important to tell you this is why I like working with dates in Tableau. There's a lot of options. There's this blue section which pulls out what are called the date parts. So the piece of the date that's relevant to what is being said. So today being March 9th, 2022, the month date part would be a 3, which if you're saying, oh, it's just the 3, that would mean all of the same months that began with March or were March would be aggregated together. That's absolutely right. The same with day. So all of the 9th days of any particular month would aggregate together. And then the year is just that year component. If you go down into this green section, these are called date values. And the way I like to think about these is it's truncating to the precision of the date you've selected. So let's say that we wanted to truncate today's date, 3/9/2022, to the year. Tableau would then magically transform that date, so to speak, to 1/1/2022. And it can kind of dial in from there. So the week, if we were starting weeks on Sunday, instead of 3/9/2022, it would be 3/6/2022. But it keeps all of that time boundness, the date nature of it. But again, for the sake of our analysis and the data that we have, I'm just going to click on the year. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to entire view again. I don't know if I set it, but the reason I'm setting it to entire view up here is to span the entire space of the worksheet. This is helpful whenever we start building a dashboard to see how things are going to lay out. It's always a good best practice to have your visualizations the entire span of the worksheet and then resize them within your dashboard to fit what it is you're trying to do. Okay, so let's now drag on the gender wage gap at median. I'm going to put it on rows. So you'll notice Tableau, first of all, set my mark type to a line. It's automatic, but let's go ahead and just force it to be a line. This is where those shelves come into play and the value that they have there. So when we have different mark types, which is just the data points that are being generated, so this being a line, we can switch it to a bar. So this is the bar is a mark versus the lines are marks here. We have different options in terms of what our kind of additional controllers for visualizations are. So right now we've got the gender wage gap median, which again, this is a sum. We could make it an average if we wanted to. I could right click, go from measure here and set it to average. That might be more appropriate because then we would say for every country underlying per year, this is what the average wage gap is. And that's just an aggregate average. It's not a weighted average based on population or anything, but this might be more appropriate. But we can also add in country to color. So I'm going to go ahead and add all members in because this tells the picture a little bit more clearly. And you'll notice here, this is set to average. So the average gender wage gap at the median is 35, 37. If I were to change this back to the sum, these numbers are not going to change because we're just reading one row of data at this point. I might as well just keep this on average because I think as we start doing more analysis, it might be easier for us not to get stuck. But this is the visual picture I wanted us to kind of sit on, which is the sparseness of the data. We could see that somewhat in here, but it's a little bit more clear in this format, which countries we might actually be able to use for analysis and which ones we might not have enough data to work with. On the right, I'm going to click this highlight button so we can start actually highlighting and seeing which countries we have long periods of data on. And I actually did a little bit of investigation beforehand into these different countries and in the data set to see which ones we might want to work with. And I came to the conclusion that maybe we start with 2016, so 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So the last 5 years of data that OECD has information for might be useful. So to that end, we can first generate a filter. So let's go ahead and click and drag year onto the filter shelf. When we do that, notice we have a very similar drop menu that we had whenever we right click and drag it onto the column shelf. It's not exactly identical, but it's very similar. But we can go ahead and pick years here. This will allow us to filter our data to a particular time period. So I'm going to click on years. Now you see we have a pick list, a multi-select pick list that we can choose from. I'm going to first click none so that none of them are selected. And then I'm going to highlight 2016 to 2020. You can also manually check these if you want. I'm just lazy, so I just highlight all of them and then I take the action of clicking them. And I'm going to click apply. So now we're saying, okay, let's look at the last 5 years of data that we have, and we can get a little bit more precise around the countries that we actually can analyze and compare with one another for the sake of what we're working on. I'm going to click OK, and I want to do a couple things. First, let's rename this and call this wage gap trend by country and year. Nothing super special in terms of how different it is from the other visualization. It's just a different chart type. But what I want you to focus on is that when we bring something onto the filter shelf, in this visualization, we've got the last 5 years, 2016 through 2020, which we've chosen. And in this one, we're still going back to 2010. So what you can do, and what I'm going to encourage you to do, and I will do, is we can make this what's called a global filter or a filter for the entire data source. So if we right click on this and we go to apply to worksheets, we can select all using this data source. That means anytime we're going to use the data source we're connected to, which is going to be for this entire training, it's going to apply this year filter everywhere. So once I've got that, you'll see a visual indicator. The cylinder icon is a common icon that denotes a database. So that means it's a data source filter. And then if I pop back over to here, you can see it now starts in 2016 and goes up through 2020. The next thing I want to do is really limit and remove a few of those countries from analysis that we're not going to be able to use. In particular, Latvia, Estonia, it looks like Iceland. There's a whole bunch of countries that we have some information for, but for whatever reason, it's not consistent throughout the time period. So Belgium's great, but we're missing 2020. And so what I want us to do is I want us to construct what is called a group in Tableau. A group is a way to generate a new category. We can call it a calculated category or just a manual grouping category of our data. And we'll do this by isolating out the countries we want to include in our analysis and those we don't want to include. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. I'm going to do the way that works the easiest for me, which is going to involve a right click. So if we right click on country and we go to create, you're going to see this section called group. Now you can do this ad hoc. You're going to use this paperclip icon if you're going to do this, but this will be a bit easier and faster and more efficient for how we're going to actually work with our data. But you'll see that there's an entire list of all the different countries that are there. And I'm just going to call this countries to keep. And we're going to start grouping them together. And what I'm looking for are countries that have data for that entire 5-year span. And I actually have a cheat sheet over here on my secondary monitor of those. I know for sure Australia is in it, so I'm just going to go ahead and first click that. I'm going to click group. So I'm going to just call this keep these. And then I'm going to check this box called include other. What that will do, so you'll see this paperclip icon, that denotes that there's actually a group. Let me go ahead and click apply so you can see over on the left what is happening here. There's a paperclip icon there as well. This will make it such that we have what's a new dimension or a new category that we can work with our data, and we'll end up using this as a filter. So we've got those that we're going to keep, which right now is just a lonely list of Australia. Let's add in Austria, so I'm just going to drag it up to be inside this keep these. We're going to do the Czech Republic, Hungary, and I will paste these into the chat in case you missed them, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Norway, the Slavic Republic, Sweden, and we can grab the United States. I'm going to hold down my control key now, and I'm going to right click, and you see there's also this add to, so you don't have to drag them up, but then you can click, drop them in to keep these. So now I've got these countries here so that we can see which ones are going to be part of that. And I have now pasted that into the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply. Nothing's happened. So let me first do this. Let me drag out countries to keep. And now you'll see I've got 2 buckets. So 2 headers over on the left. The ones I want to keep, which have these nice unbroken lines, they've got trends for the last 5 years of data. And then I've got those that don't have a full length of data for that time period. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to exclude those others. So if you right click on other, you can click exclude. If you look up on the filter shelf, and I'm going to undo so you can see it, and I'll redo it. So again, I'm right click exclude. It adds that to our filter shelf. So now if I go in and I show you this filter, and I'm doing this by, you guessed it, right clicking, and you see edit the filter, it has excluded other from this visualization. Now, if you're tracking, it's not excluded here yet because we don't have it persisting on the other worksheets, but we're going to do that now. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this to all using that data source so that now we've got just those 11 countries that I have isolated out that have data for the entire 5-year span. And it's important to say why we're doing this. One, if we're going to do any sort of comparative analysis, we're going to need data for this time period. And 2, it also makes sense in terms of why I'm doing this because I'm allowed to be a little bit choosy on which data I want to use. Now, that's a strong statement, and it comes with a lot of guardrails and that whole kind of Spider-Man concept of with great power comes great responsibility. You can't just exclude data because you don't like it, but it does make sense to exclude data if it's sparse or not adding value to what you're trying to analyze. So if the message of what I'm trying to analyze is let's compare how the gender wage gap has changed across these 11 countries over the past 5 years, that makes it extremely relevant. Okay. So now we've got these 11 countries. I'm going to actually drag this countries to keep dimension or group that we generated off of the visualization because we don't need it. It's sort of a redundant header. And I actually want to just analyze what we've got going on here because there's some really powerful insights. And as my mouse is spinning, I'm also going to save my workbook. The very first time I did one of these trainings, My workbook crashed at the very end, and it was unpleasant. Tableau does auto-save your work along the way, but I always think it's a better practice to save your work as you are generating worksheets. It's also important that I haven't called it out specifically, but this undo, this back button, you get infinite undo and redo in the Tableau desktop realm as long as you keep the workbook open for any given period of time. And this is a lot of the way that analysis works in general when you start working with data. You're going to start going down these paths of building charts, trying to understand, pull out some insights, use them further along the way, maybe say, this wasn't what I intended to do. I'm often known to say it's going to look really ugly before it looks pretty. Like this is a good example of a spaghetti chart with a lot of colors that's kind of hard to see on the eyes, but is a step in the right direction. And this is a good way for you to start thinking about Tableau Desktop in particular. You're not always going to build a pixel perfect chart or dashboard in the beginning. It's going to take a lot of trial and error, a lot of undo, redo, changing things up until you get the right visualizations to tell the story that you're looking for. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second, and then let's actually focus on what we're seeing. So we've got our 11 countries here. Tableau's automatically colored them. The colors are a little bit busy, but let's actually synthesize and understand what it is we're looking at. So now we're seeing the wage gap trend by country and year for 11 countries. Korea clearly jumps out. It started off at 37%. So like I said, women are making 63 cents on the dollar or 63 cents on whatever the currency is compared to men, which is tremendous. They're making a third less. That's still the case as of 2020. Then we've got Japan here. So again, we've got two sort of Western in style Asian countries that have very high wage gaps. Then we've got the United States right here. So it's in third place roughly, which is a bit disappointing being an American citizen and being a woman, meaning ideally I might make 18 cents less on the dollar than my male counterparts, which doesn't please me. Then we've got Mexico here, which is kind of a bit up and down depending on when you look at it, right? They had 17%, then they went down to 11, and then in 2019, they were back up to 19, and their latest reporting year is at 10%. So this could be interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it could be policy changes, or it could be how they're actually reporting it back to OECD in terms of why that number isn't necessarily stable and doesn't show a significant or common trend in the downward direction. What we would expect to see, right, and I can speak to this as because I'm an American and as probably are you, is that we would hope that that wage gap would continue to decline over time and that we would see parity between men and women. Let's take a look at a couple others to see what we're at. Here's Sweden and Norway, two of the best. I think we all probably know they're the best because they have great gender equity policies, not only around pay, but also around maternity and paternity leave. So I'm not surprised to see that these numbers are closer to zero and less disparation between the two of them. But this at least helps us to kind of understand what it is that we're looking at along the way. So now that we've done that, I want to start looking at another measure, and then let's start thinking about what maybe a dashboard could be. So now we've got the wage gap trend by country and year. We're kind of isolating in on a couple things, which is Korea is really tough. The numbers are really separated out there, and we're gonna build some things that kind of show what that means from a monetary perspective. But let's also look at the board seat percentage distribution and the female managers. I think it's obvious to all of us, particularly for those two roles, that we would say those folks make more money. There are executives, there are leaders in business and in industry. So let's see what the proportion of female versus male managers and female versus male board members looks like. So this is not even talking about wage at this point. This is just talking about representation in leadership and decision-making roles. So let's build the same thing. This time, let's go super fast. So we're going to drag on year. Let's pop that on. Let's put country back on color again. We're going to add all of our members. I'm going to set this to entire view. This is what I mean by it's going to look ugly before it looks pretty because we've got a bunch of squares that aren't representing anything. But let's drag on our percentage of female managers. So now let's look at this and think about how this relates to what we had before. Let me go ahead and call this percent female managers by year and country. Are we surprised by anything? Are we surprised that in Korea, in terms of female representation in managerial roles, it's up to 16%? That's its high point. So whatever that is, less than 1 in 5, 1 in 6 managers in Korea are women. And similarly, when we go back and we look at the wage gap, that's where the most disparity is. I think that there's some relationship potentially there that we might be able to explore. More interesting than that, I think, is maybe where the US comes out, where we're doing actually pretty decent compared to the peers inside of our scope of analysis in terms of parity, male to female, assuming we've got 50% men and women in any given population, which we'll explore. But this makes a little bit more sense. It's still 40-60 split, so we're still a little bit more toward males, but at least it's kind of at the top end, which means there might be something different at play than in Korea. I don't know that we'll come up with an answer, but it's a good talking point along the way. And it's also good to see that, remember, Japan and Korea were both at the very top here, and now they're at the very bottom here. So clearly there must be some type of relationship, whether it's statistical and mathematical, maybe we'll find out, but there's clearly something at play such that we've got lower female representation in managerial roles and also more of a discrepancy when it comes to wage. Let's look at some of these middle ones and let's see where Sweden actually comes out. So Sweden right here is near the top. It looks like they've been increasing over the past few years of what that looks like. And then Norway is the dark green. So they're looking at about a third, and it looks like it's gone down a little bit over the past few years or more recent years. And then this one in the middle, Czech Republic. Let's see what the Czech Republic was over here. So the right in the middle, so there's like a 16%-ish, kind of going down 12%. And then if we look back, the Czech Republic just stands out in the middle. It looks like maybe they're one to watch. So they're trying to kind of go up into this more like 1 in 3 scenario as opposed to 1 in 4 scenario. Let's look at one more chart, which is going to be exactly the same. And actually, let's be fancy here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to duplicate this. So that's going to make an exact copy of the chart we had before. And just to save ourselves a whole bunch of time, I'm going to drag female board seats on top of the other measure. So now we're switching it. So before I had percentage of female managers. When I drag female board seats directly on top, it's going to switch over. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to rename this because now you can see it's just got that parentheses 2 because it's a copy. But instead, let's just call it board members, percent female board members by country and year. And let's look at what we've got here. This is a bit tough. I mean, it's useful, but it could be a bit tough because I honestly don't have any context as to how many major organizations or major public companies there are in these various countries. Certainly for the United States, you know, you think about any of those that are on the stock market, those would be up for fair grabs in terms of their board members. So it's always useful that we can at least look at the US and say, look, was 1 in 5 in 2016. We're still 1 in 4-ish, not even 1 in 3 in 2020. But also to see, again, you see Norway and Sweden coming up closer to the top. And this is actually nice to see that you're seeing Norway's at 40% board member seats, and they're about around there, if not higher for board than managerial. And Sweden's kind of in a similar camp. It looks like Sweden's probably tracking together with those two metrics at the same cadence, so to speak. And then, of course, let's see where Korea and Japan come out. Now, again, you look at the scales on these two are identical. This goes up to 44 and this goes up to 44, but there's a lot more separation among the different countries, which could also be quite interesting. Korea is still down at the bottom here. And then we've got Japan. It looks like Mexico is low on the list as well, whereas Mexico had much higher representation in terms of managerial roles. So that's also quite interesting. Okay. So now we've kind of internalized a few insights about some various countries. Let's do some more ad hoc analysis, and then let's start building out a dashboard. So the last chart I want to build is something that I think I've said, which might be on your mind as well. Is there a relationship, either mathematical or otherwise, that says the percentage of women that are in managerial roles might have some effect, let's call it, on the wage gap. And what I mean by that is think about, go back to high school algebra. Think about X being your independent variable and Y being your dependent variable. This is where we say you need to be a little bit numerate. So X being, does the percentage of women in managerial roles have an influence or impact the wage gap in a given country? So what we're going to do is we're going to build a scatter plot that's going to have those two measures, and we're going to see if we can't use Tableau to analyze and come up with any sort of relationship, mathematical, statistical, or otherwise. I like to use the word relationship. If you are very on the nose, you're probably thinking correlation in your mind, and that is where we're headed. So I'm going to drag out the percentage of female workers, and I'm going to put that on my x-axis. Again, this is a sum, so this isn't super relevant. We could change it to an average. That way, at least it's not over aggregating. So for this entire data set of those countries we chose to keep for those 5 years, we're saying that that average number is 32%. Let's do the same thing. I'm going to right click and drag the gender wage gap at median. That way we don't do a sum, and we'll choose the aggregation. This is why right click is fantastic, because you'll save yourself a lot of steps if you know you need to have a different aggregation. And we don't have anything awesome right now. We have one data point, which says the average percentage of female managers across all those countries. If we added up all those percentages and we divided by the number of countries and years, is 32%, and the wage gap is 15%. It gets more interesting when we start adding on more detail or disaggregating the data that we have. And this is where the detail shelf comes into play. So we can add country onto detail. And I might actually also drag country onto color so that you guys see what it is we're doing. So now before, and let me just take it off here so we only have it on country or only on color, where we had one data point that was the aggregate of all of the countries, we now have a data point that is the aggregate of all the years for each country. And so then in that same fashion, I can drag year onto our detail shelf, either just down here on the marks card, that's kind of a shortcut, or you can drag it on the detail. They do the same thing. You can see this icon means detail. You can also switch which shelf it's on by doing this, so I could have them on color as well. This is a bit busy. We call this a confetti chart. So I'll take it off color for now, but this gives you a good idea of what we've got. So now every mark here, every data point here, and you can actually see there's a really close clustering for each of these particular countries, which is not surprising because these measures shouldn't be changing dramatically, swing high and low year to year if they're measuring it accurately. But you can see a data point for every country and every year. So here's Japan, which we keep talking about, and Korea, where you can see what that wage gap is. There it is. It's very high for 2016. And you can see, again, it's not really about the trend, but you can see where it all comes out to be. I'm going to click on color, on the color icon over here, and I'm just going to put this on detail for just a bit. I'm going to do that because we're going to drag on a trend line and you'll kind of see what happens. And so the question I'm asking myself, or maybe you're posing to me, is does the percentage of female managers have a relationship or a correlation with what the gender gap is or the wage gap is? So I'm going to drag on this trend line. You've got a lot of fit options whenever you're working with data in Tableau. For now, I'm just going to keep it easy. You know, I said that whole algebra equation y equals mx plus b. So that just means a line. We're going to try to draw a line of best fit, so to speak, with our data points and see what we can infer. And what I'll do next is I'm going to hover over there. I won't spend a ton of time looking at the mathematical and the stats of it, but I want to show you a couple things, which is first, you can see that Tableau has created an equation saying that if you forced my hand, if you wanted me to do this, that I could predict, or I could say what the wage gap at the median is equivalent to 0.6 times the average percentage of female managers plus an offset of 36 points, basically. And then the other two things to read here are the p-value, which relates to how many data points we have, or the sample size. The smaller the p-value, the closer it is to 0. The better our sample is, or the better it is at actually being able to draw the line. So that just means we have 55 data points here. That's sufficient to sort of draw this line. And then the r-squared value, which can be a number between 0 and 1. The best part to say in this stats lesson that I'm giving you on the fly is the closer that r-squared number is to 1, the more of the behavior or where the dots are land on the line. So if r squared were 1, every dot would sit perfectly on that line. Since every dot doesn't sit perfectly on the line, we can see, 62% of where the dots lay out are related or have some correlation. There's a relationship, is how I would like to say this, with the data, with the average percentage of female managers. Now, the only other thing I want to do here, because I feel like this is a little bit misleading, because usually when we think about this, up is better, but up is actually worse on our average gender wage gap at the median. So I'm actually going to edit this axis. I wouldn't normally do this, but I think it'll be more helpful, is I'm going to reverse it. So now we go from 0 all the way down. And so what we're looking at here is there a positive or negative relationship between these two numbers? Meaning, as the percentage of female managers goes up for a given country, for a given year, do we see the wage gap decrease? That is the positive relationship. That is the slope of the line, so to speak, which is now going up and to the right. And so we can see it would be, I'm far too conservative to say there is a statistical relationship, but it's very fair to say that for most countries, for most years of reporting, that the more women representation and the more female representation we have in managerial roles, the less of a wage gap we incur, which is a very fantastic insight. This is a great thing to describe for policy change. Step 1 might be, let's just get more women representation in general and see what happens. This is also where the value of Tableau comes in, because I could easily take my percentage of female managers and swap that out for board seat members. This one, it looks like we've got less described in the R squared. That probably has to do with what we saw with Mexico in particular and kind of the separation among some of these. It's not quite as tight among their peers, but there's still the same concept that there is some sort of positive relationship that ideally in countries and situations of record where there are more females that are board members, that the wage gap is lower. And I think if you're thinking, duh, and this obviously makes sense, well, sure. But again, now we have data as evidence and proof to be able to communicate that. So again, you think about what you're doing and how you want to kind of play out your data story or how we might want to work with data. This is a really easy way to kind of use Tableau to your advantage. And let's actually keep it like this. I'm going to go back one. And let's just call this, is there a relationship between female managers and wage gap? And I think the answer is yes. I'll leave it to you to decide coming off of this if you believe the same is true or not, but certainly there's some compelling evidence here along the way. Okay, I'm looking at my watch. We've got about 7.5 minutes. So I'm going to start doing a couple of things really fast so we can get to the point where we have a dashboard and we talk about building out a data story. So I'm going to first click on this 4 square icon and build a new dashboard. I get this question all the time, so it's about size. I'm going to take my default size and I'm going to enhance this. In the business world, I usually say 1400 by 900 or 1000 pixels, something that will fit on a screen. You are looking at my screen and saying, well, you've got a lot more canvas space. That's because I'm on a 32-inch monitor. But most people you'll work with are probably going to be on either a laptop or something that's a little bit smaller. So you always want to make sure, if possible, all your data fits in the confines of a single screen. A lot of applicants that we see will end up doing a little bit taller, so they almost do what's called a poster style viz, where they'll start at the top and work their way down. Vertical scrolling is fine. Horizontal scrolling is the bad one. You never want to do horizontal scrolling. But again, for the sake of this, let's just keep it at that 1400. I'll keep it at 1100 because I've got a couple more pixels on my screen to be able to work with. And now let's start building out a dashboard and maybe taking some of the analysis that we did along the way and coming up with some sort of compelling data story. The last chart maybe we build or viz is, let's just build a map. I like to double click on this because it's really easy when you're getting started with Tableau. So if I double click on country, we're going to see all of those countries that were in our data set now plotted. This is called a symbol map. We've got data for United States, for Mexico, Sweden, Norway. There's Japan. I'm going to point your eyes down to the bottom right here that says there's one unknown value. That's fine. So the one value that's missing is actually Korea. That's because Tableau is not sure if I meant North Korea or South Korea. So if you're working with your data and it says, hey, there's an unrecognized location, you can click on this drop down and you can manually map it. So I'm going to type in Korea. Actually just going to go down to South Korea. And now we can go ahead and pop that in. And let me just undo. Focus your eyes right here on South Korea. Once I set up that mapping, now it shows up there. And then let's do the same thing. Let me actually bring on the gender wage gap at median. I'm going to bring it on as an average. So I'm right-click dragging, and there it is as an average. Light blue to dark blue doesn't really make sense. Let's go back to coloring this, and let's choose a different color ramp. So let's do the red to gold. Well, maybe we do. There's like a green to gold. There we go. Let's do this one. But let's actually reverse this because the greener it is, the better. So this tells a little bit better of a story. So here we've got, and I can take my map. This is the toolbar of the map. I'm going to drag this. And let's actually just recenter it so that the US isn't so much dominating the screen and we can actually see a little bit of the other countries. So I'm going to just kind of sneak Alaska off to the left just because it takes up so much land mass. And now let's kind of look visually at our map. So we can see a couple things. This is where geography kind of matters. So now we're seeing a little bit clearer of a data picture. We don't have that many countries, but at least we can say, look, in the Northern European countries, it's clear that there's less of a wage gap disparity than maybe the sort of Eastern European countries. We can see that the Asian countries are really having a tougher situation, and then Australia and the United States and even Mexico are sort of like getting closer along the way. But I figured we'd just make a map so we could kind of visually see where these are. And this gives us some good information in terms of the pockets that we've got for our analysis. Maybe if we had more time, we'd kind of like section them off by continent or by region so that we didn't have just this giant map that was like, we have no data, and we focused on more of the data that we do have. But I wanted to just kind of bring a map so we could get that going. Let me just call this the average wage gap by country so that we've got that going. Okay, so back to dashboard one. Let's first start with like building out what we actually want to call the dashboard. And all I'm doing in the bottom left is clicking show dashboard title. Right now, it's just inferring what the dashboard title is as the sheet name. All of these are called sheets, so to speak. So this is just dashboard one. If I rename this to hello, we'll see that it does that as well. So let's go ahead and rename this to how gender wage gaps in specific countries. And let's just start with something basic like that, and let's see what we can do. So let's first bring on our average wage gap by country map. You'll notice a couple things. When I drag onto a dashboard, you can see this sort of light gray. This is where Tableau wants to drop that visualization. So when I bring the map on, it's going to drop it there. If I bring on my trend, you can see that it will try to, this is called tiling, tile it into another specific area, and it'll start resizing along the way. And we'll use that to our advantage when we start building out dashboards. So let's start with the map. I'm thinking we'll probably end up changing this because I might want this to be more of a controller than having that average wage gap across the years. So let's actually bring the country trend in like I had before. On the right, we've got a couple color legends that Tableau is automatically generating. I actually don't like the Tableau color legends. I like to use other things, whether it's text or other phrasing throughout, or maybe make my own color legends. I kind of just think this is sort of clutter. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this from my dashboard. And let's bring in maybe one more, which is the % female managers. Let's just do that to begin with. We're going to have to do some serious visualization cleanup, but this is at least a good start. So let me go back in here, and I'm going to take this measurement off of the map. So now we just have a map for each country, and I'm going to change it to a filled map. We're going to use this as sort of a controller, and I'm going to hold down my control key, and I'm going to drag country onto color. We'll stick with these colors for now, but what I'm trying to gear us up for is think of these as buttons that we'll use interactively on our dashboard, so that if I either hover or click on the United States as an example, I can use that to highlight or isolate data in my other charts. And let me actually show you what that'll look like now. So first, let me just right click and hide this title, because that's not really what this represents. These are just the countries that we have. And I'm going to click on this visualization, and on the right, you're going to see this funnel icon, and it says use as a filter. I'm going to click on it. And now notice what happens when I click on Australia. In the two charts below, we have filtered our data set to just Australia. And if I click off of it, we've got them all back again. I can draw a box, and so I can highlight both the United States and Mexico, and now they are both there. So if we were building an exploratory data visualization where we were building for someone, and this is very rudimentary, obviously, hey, a tool to be able to compare the wage gaps and the percentage of female managers for the countries that I so choose, they could certainly click on this. I'm going to now hold down my control key. I want to compare Australia to Mexico to the United States to South Korea. And now they have an interactive tool to be able to let them do those. Instead of that, though, what I want to do is I'm going to uncheck this or untick it. So now I'm not using it as a filter. So if I click on Australia, we're just seeing that highlight. And that's actually the action that I want. But I want this to be on hover. And this is where the dashboard side and the interactive side becomes really fun and cool. This is one of my favorite parts about Tableau, is we can build interactivity along the way. So what I want to do is I want to be able to hover on a country, and I want it to highlight inside of these bottom charts. So I'm going to go up to dashboard, and I'm going to go to action. These are called dashboard actions. You can see there's already a few that were set up, but I'm going to go ahead and remove these so we start from scratch. And we're going to add an action. There's many different action types, but the one we're going to do is the highlight action, which is what I'm sort of describing, where if we hover on a country or a data point, a mark, so to speak, maybe in the map, we'll see it change in these other charts. And actually, as we're thinking about it, I'm like, well, it would be fine if we just hover anywhere that it does this. So I'm going to change this to be called highlight country. So the source sheets are the ones where we'll actually do that hover action. And the target sheets are the ones where that will be applied to, where the highlight will take place. Now, the last step here is we're going to select fields, and I'm just going to select the country so that when we hover, we'll see just that country highlight along the way. And I'm going to go in and let's actually adjust some of these. So first, let's just edit this and call this wage gap for our axis, because it's a little bit much to have it say more. Let's right click and let's hide the field label for the row. The reason I'm doing this is it's kind of obvious what the years are, and we're sort of saying that in the title. So we don't need additional sort of what's called chart junk to be able to tell the story. I'm actually also going to go in and go to workbook, and I'm going to format my grid lines, and let's turn those off for the entire workbook. So when we get here, we've got that also off. I'm going to hide the field labels there. Percentage of female managers, that's actually probably okay. So we're getting a little bit cleaner already. And then let's see what else we can do here. Let's go back in, and I'm guessing you guys will want me to do this as well. We'll take my country, I'm going to drag that onto label. And now we're labeling all these. This is what it means by we can be a little bit more direct with how we're actually encoding our data, as we call it, so that we've got it directly labeled, and we can actually be fancy. This is one of my favorite little Tableau features, is if I go into the label, I can customize what it looks like, but the most important thing I want to do is I want to match the mark color, and let's make it bolder. So that now, if we go back to our dashboard, I hover over, I'll pick one that's not going to be too big. There's United States or maybe Norway. It's much more clear, and we can even put that in the label here. I'm going to hold down my control key again, and we'll add it to the label. Let's go ahead and match the mark color and make that one bold as well. A little bit tough because we've got some small countries and a lot of map. Let's go into our percent of female managers. Let's do the same thing. Just match the formatting. This is where it's also probably better for you to duplicate, because you can copy all your formatting without having to actually reinvent all of your formatting over and over again. You can kind of do it once and get away with that. I'm going to save one more time. So let's just see where we're at. Let's hover over our United States. There's our Mexico. And I might actually go in and do one more thing, which is allow labels to overlap other marks. And we could even also do this on highlighted, which means two things. If I go back so you can see the left one now, if I highlight this now, it shows the label when it's highlighted and we're not cut off by how much visual white space there is. I've told Tableau it's really important for me to see the label. So let's do that on the other one as well. And let's do it on highlighted and allow it to overlap. So now when I hover, it's much more clear. And that's, I think, a little bit more helpful whenever we're doing our sort of analysis at the end, when we're talking about what we're going to be doing, to see where those things come out. Let's also go in and just do a little bit more formatting. I know I've hit the 1 hour mark, so I'll ask the team, are we still good to keep on going a bit further and kind of round out this dashboard? I'll take silence as yes. Okay, thanks, Luke. Okay, so let's do a couple more things, which are, let's fix the tooltip. I love tooltips in Tableau because they really communicate what the data point or the mark represents. This is a little bit hard to read. I would prefer that these are in sentence format or something a little bit more friendly. So if we click on tooltip, there's a small menu that's going to come up and you'll see two things. One, these are the labels that are associated with each of those fields. And then the darker, the black, or the bold, darker and bold and blackish. It's not really totally black, but those are the fields. Those are the dynamic data point elements. And that's what's basically allowing these to be different numbers and different points. So let's go ahead and let's adjust this. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to take off that label for country. I'm going to just use a vertical pipe here. And what we'll do is I'm going to take this year of year out because that's super redundant. This sounds like a computer generated this analysis, which it did. And then, so now we've got, I'm going to build this in kind of piecemeal so you can see it. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Let me just show you what I've got so far. So now we've got Korea 2016 and then this 35%. So we can say women earned, and then this is our wage gap percentage, less than men. And I like to do, maybe let's make this unbold. And now as we read it, so in Korea in 2016, women earned 37% less, maybe we even say salary, money. This is where we start getting to a little bit more precision of language and we talk about what we're communicating along the way. I'm even going to go in and I'm going to copy this tooltip so we can save ourselves some time. And let's go to our other chart, which is this one. And let's do something very similar. And let's go into the tooltip. I'm going to just push enter a couple times so we can reuse some of those things. And let's change our message to delete this out. So I basically want to say, what is the percentage of managerial roles held by females? So in the Czech Republic in 2017, 25% of managerial roles were held by a female. So this becomes a little bit more friendly in terms of language. And then maybe we'll actually go back in and let's add the title. And let's just do hover on country to explore the stats, something basic like that. I certainly would do a lot more if we had more time, but this is at least a good way to get started in terms of how you're thinking about things. And I might even take this off because it's a bit redundant. We've got that in the title of the chart as well. And then we've got our wage gap. So now we come in and we look at the United States. We can see where that is compared to its peers. We've got like a nice sort of comparative analysis along the way. And then the last thing I want to leave you with, just to kind of show you art of possible, and it's not going to make its way onto the dashboard, but I thought this would be a fun thing to show you, is in the Tableau world, we can use something called parameters. So parameters are entry boxes or input boxes that users can add things into. So these live outside of your data set. They live inside of the workbook by itself, but they're a great way to use them to add on, to allow people to input things. So in particular, where we've got our wage gap trend and we're saying that women in Korea earn 34% less than men, it would actually be helpful if we turn those into monetary dollars and use that for our analysis. So I'm going to do a couple things. I'll do them pretty quick. first we're going to click on this drop down and we're going to create a parameter. So we're going to call this base male salary. And the idea behind this is we're just going to have an entry box. We're going to leave it as a number that we'll put in there, but in theory, we'll be able to change it, or our end users could change it if they wanted to make it different. We're going to make this a float, which just means it can be a decimal, and we're going to call it 70,000. I'm going to use 70,000 because 70,000 is in America where they say you kind of hit this happy point of you have enough money that you need to survive and live comfortably. So if you're making $70,000 or more annually in terms of salary, you should have safety, security, a home, a reasonable car, a Netflix subscription, etc. So there's our base male salary, and nothing's happening when I do this, but I'm going to go ahead and drag our country back on. Let's drag our year on as well. Let me set this to the entire view. If I put base male salary on text, it's just 70,000 everywhere. But this is where we get kind of interesting, is we say, okay, so what is the relative female salary? So the female salary is going to be, this is our calculated field. It's going to be the male salary, so our base male salary, and I'm going to make this a lot larger. I'm holding down my control key and zooming in with my scroll wheel. So it's the base salary minus the base male salary times the wage gap, meaning if I say someone earned 34% less, we're taking 70,000 times 34%. That's the number we're subtracting off of the 70,000 here. And then let me go ahead and just make this dollars as well, so that we're apples to apples in terms of how it comes onto the screen. And let me actually pop this in here as well. And I'm going to move this just so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. Oh, and I've made one little error, which is our percentage points are not percentage points, they're actual numbers. So we're going to take this number and we're going to divide it by 100. So it's clearly not the case that they earn $889,000 less. So let's just add on that divided by 100. So here you go. Let's look at this, and I'm actually going to swap these so we can read it a bit more clearly. This just swaps our rows and columns. So if we look at this in Australia, if a man is making $70,000 per year, a female is making $61,000. Let's find Korea in this equation and look at this. This is very tangible numbers in terms of what it means for a difference. And we could certainly go a lot further with this and maybe make it a bar chart. Would maybe be a good one to do. Let's see if I can't get a bar chart working how I want it to be. Maybe we just choose Korea here so we can then compare. And I'm going to hold down my control key and I'm going to put this on color. So now when we really talk about monetary disparity, this tells the visual story a lot more clearly and a lot more viscerally than just the percentage points. It makes a hell of a lot more difference when we say that a woman is earning almost $30,000 a year less in Korea based on whatever the salary happens to be. And again, we're talking median salary here. There's certainly more at the different extremes of that data set that I didn't include, but this is one way we can make a more compelling data set. And this is where it's kind of interesting in the power of Tableau. I can show that parameter. The base salary is 70,000. But if I took that down to 50,000, we can see what that nets out to be. So now we're saying you're making 31,000 versus 50. So again, we're talking about a $20,000 difference. That's almost half. I mean, we know what it is. We know it's about a third of the salary, but this communicates a more clear picture. It makes a lot more sense if you tell someone, hey, you're making X number of dollars less than just the percentage points. So I will leave it there. I know we just made a super basic dashboard, but I'm hoping through this, the hour long that you had with me, that you were able to follow along and build out some of these different chart types and learn a little bit from me about how we can communicate data and how to work with the data we have and some of the fun things that you can do and use in Tableau Desktop.